Imagine living in the heart of the world's most powerful empire, a place of marble palaces, blood-soaked arenas, and gods who seemed to walk among men. Rome was the center of civilization, a city that ruled continents and defined culture for centuries. But beneath the shining armor of its legions and the grandeur of its temples, there existed a darker, hidden Rome, a world of superstition, secrets, and taboos so shocking that even mentioning them could lead to exile, punishment, or death. We often think of the Romans as rational, practical people, engineers of aqueducts, inventors of concrete, masters of law. Yet, the same people who built the greatest empire on earth also lived in fear of invisible forces, divine wrath, and forbidden acts that could curse not just an individual, but an entire city. These weren't just religious restrictions, they were deeply woven into the psychology of Roman life. So, what exactly did the Romans consider forbidden? What were the taboos so strong that even the most powerful emperors dared not break them? Let's start with something that might surprise you: death itself. To the Romans, death wasn't just a natural event. It was a pollutant. A corpse was considered so unclean that priests were forbidden from even touching one. Houses where someone had died were marked and avoided. They became tainted places until elaborate purification rituals were performed. Funerals couldn't happen within the city walls because death, in their eyes, was the ultimate form of impurity. Imagine living in a culture where grief had to be hidden behind rituals, where mourning too openly was seen as almost dangerous, as if the sadness could summon evil spirits. Then there was the taboo of breaking oaths. To swear falsely in Rome wasn't merely a moral sin, it was a cosmic one. An oath was a contract with the gods, and lying under oath meant inviting their wrath. Romans believed Jupiter himself, the king of gods, would strike down liars with thunderbolts. It's why political alliances, military pacts, and even personal promises were often sealed in temples before statues of deities. To lie under their watchful gaze was to risk your soul, and sometimes your life. But perhaps the most paradoxical taboo of all was talking about the emperors as mortals. During the height of the empire, emperors weren't just rulers. They were divine figures. Once deified by the Senate, criticizing them or even joking about them became a dangerous offense. Poets and philosophers who dared to mock imperial authority could be exiled, tortured, or executed. In this sense, freedom of speech, something we cherish today, was itself a taboo in ancient Rome. And yet, for all their rules and restrictions, the Romans had other taboos that were far stranger, acts involving the body, religion, and even daily behavior that to us might seem almost absurd. One of the most curious taboos in Roman life revolved around the mixing of the sacred and the profane. Religion was everywhere in Rome. Every meal, every journey, every political act began with a prayer or offering to the gods. But there were strict limits about what could or could not be done in the presence of the divine. Eating, for instance, inside a temple was considered deeply disrespectful. The Romans believed that mortal appetites, hunger, desire, even laughter, had no place before the gods. To mix human pleasure with divine space was to insult the heavens themselves. Another shocking taboo concerned women and purity. In Roman society, women were expected to embody modesty and virtue, but there were some roles that carried such sacred weight that breaking the associated taboos could bring a death sentence. The best example? The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, protectors of the sacred flame of Rome. These women were chosen as children and sworn to 30 years of chastity. Their task was to ensure that the flame, symbol of Rome's eternal life, never went out. But the rule was absolute. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, she wasn't executed in a normal way. She was buried alive. Why? Because her body was sacred. Spilling her blood would defile the city. So the Romans devised a cruel loophole. They would place her in an underground chamber with a small lamp, bread, milk, and oil, and seal the entrance. The gods, they said, would decide her fate. It was a terrifying punishment, but it reveals how Romans viewed the boundaries of purity and sin. To them, some acts didn't just break laws, they shattered the cosmic balance of the world. And yet the Romans were full of contradictions. They could tolerate extreme violence in the Colosseum, men torn apart by beasts, slaves fighting to the death, but they had taboos against certain kinds of death. Killing a parent, for example, was the worst crime imaginable. The punishment for parricide was ritualistic and horrifying. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, and then thrown into the river. Each animal represented a sin, the barking of guilt, the crowing of shame, the coiling of deceit, and the river carried the curse away from the city. Even execution in Rome was theater, but theater ruled by taboo. Another forbidden act was disturbing the peace of the dead. Tomb robbers were seen not just as criminals, but as blasphemers. Desecrating a grave risked invoking manes. the spirits of the dead, who could return as vengeful ghosts. Romans placed curses on tombstones warning anyone who dared to open or move their graves. May the gods and spirits strike down whoever disturbs this resting place. Some believed that even saying a dead person's name too often could draw their shade back from the underworld. In daily life, Romans avoided all kinds of unlucky omens, sneezing before a journey, tripping over the threshold, or hearing a crow at dawn. These were small, invisible taboos that shaped how they moved, spoke, and even thought, and they took them very seriously. To break one might not bring immediate punishment, but it could invite the silent judgment of the gods, which was far worse. Let's dive even deeper into the strange and forbidden heart of Roman life, where religion, superstition, and everyday reality blended into one. Perhaps the most powerful and mysterious taboos in Rome were those linked to magic and witchcraft. The Romans feared sorcery, but they also couldn't resist it. Many secretly turned to spells, potions, and charms to attract love, to curse enemies, or to gain favor from the gods. Yet, officially, magic was illegal, at least when it threatened order or the emperor's authority. One of the most feared acts was the creation of curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with hateful words and folded around strands of hair or bits of clothing from the victim. These tablets were then buried in graves or thrown into wells to call upon dark spirits to torment the target. The practice was common, archaeologists have found hundreds of them, but it was also forbidden. If someone was caught performing such a ritual, they could be accused of maleficium, evil-doing, a crime punishable by death. The Romans believed that witches could control life and death, influence love, and even summon the dead, powers that challenged the gods and the emperor alike. And the line between superstition and crime was thin. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, new laws banned not only dangerous sorcery but also unauthorized divination. That meant predicting the future without permission from the state was a taboo. Why? Because prophecy was power. And in Rome, power belonged only to the emperor and the gods that favored him. Even naming was surrounded by taboo. The Romans treated names as magical symbols, especially the true names of people, families, and even the city of Rome itself. According to ancient writers, the city had a secret name known only to its priests. To speak it aloud was to give enemies the power to curse the entire empire. That's why Rome's true name has been lost forever, deliberately erased from memory to protect it from dark magic. Another curious taboo was crossing certain boundaries, both literal and symbolic. The city of Rome had sacred limits called the Pomerium, an invisible border that marked the divide between the city of peace and the land of war. No armed soldier was allowed to cross it without permission. For a general to march his troops into the city meant rebellion, civil war, or tyranny. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 before Christ, he didn't just break a political rule, he shattered a sacred taboo. His act was so shocking that people said he had invoked the wrath of the gods themselves. And it wasn't just soldiers. Crossing social boundaries was equally taboo. A senator dressing like a commoner, a woman speaking in the Senate, a slave touching his master, all could be seen as acts of moral chaos. Roman society was built on hierarchy, and to blur its lines was to offend the natural order. It's no wonder that Romans used the word sacer, which could mean both holy and accursed, to describe those who violated sacred or social laws. They weren't simply outcasts, they were cursed beings, exiled from both the world of men and the world of gods. The more we uncover these hidden taboos, the clearer it becomes that Rome wasn't just ruled by emperors or armies. It was ruled by belief. Belief in purity, fate, and invisible power, and fear that breaking a single taboo could bring ruin to everything you loved. When we look closer at Roman society, we see that taboos didn't only shape religion or law, they reached deep into the private corners of everyday life. What people ate, how they spoke, even how they loved, was surrounded by invisible lines that no respectable Roman dared to cross. Let's begin with something as simple and as intimate as food. The Romans were adventurous eaters by ancient standards. They dined on exotic dishes like flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, and garum, a strong fermented fish sauce that flavored almost everything. But even in their feasts, there were strict taboos. Certain foods were forbidden to specific social classes or religious orders. For instance, priests of Jupiter could not eat beans, goats, or certain fish, because they were believed to carry impure energies that might defile the divine within them. And for ordinary Romans, eating or drinking during certain sacred days was unthinkable. On fast days, breaking that rule wasn't just bad manners, it was a sin that could anger the gods. Superstitions even extended to how they ate. Dropping bread on the floor was bad luck. Spilling wine was seen as an omen of coming misfortune, and it was taboo to cut bread with a knife since bread symbolized life itself. You had to break it with your hands, gently, respectfully, as if offering a piece of life to the gods. The body itself was full of taboos. Cleanliness, for example, was a moral duty. Public baths were central to Roman life, but they weren't just about hygiene. They were about ritual purity. Yet, there were strict unwritten rules. Slaves bathed at different hours, men and women were separated, except during certain scandals when emperors ignored the taboo, and entering the baths without first removing your sandals or jewelry was seen as deeply improper. The idea was that dirt on the body could be washed away, but spiritual dirt, moral corruption, could not. And when it came to sex and love, Rome was both indulgent and repressive. To modern eyes, Roman art and literature seem shockingly open about sexuality. But beneath that freedom lay a web of invisible prohibitions. For example, men could pursue relationships with slaves or prostitutes without shame, but to play the passive role in any encounter was considered disgraceful. A freeborn Roman male who allowed himself to be dominated was said to have lost his virtues, his masculine virtue, and could be mocked, blackmailed, or even politically destroyed for it. Women, meanwhile, lived under a constant shadow of purity taboos. A wife accused of adultery could be publicly humiliated, divorced, or even killed by her husband with little consequence. Yet the same husband could openly visit brothels or keep mistresses. Hypocrisy? Certainly. But to the Romans, maintaining appearances mattered more than personal morality. To protect a family's honor was to protect its spiritual power, and honor, once tainted, could never be cleansed. Even language itself had its taboos. Certain words were avoided in daily speech, believed to bring bad luck or attract evil spirits. The Romans used euphemisms for death, saying, "He has gone to the gods," instead of "he died." They avoided saying fire inside houses, fearing it might invite an actual blaze. And the word for left, sinister, became so associated with misfortune that it shaped the modern meaning of the word we still use today. When we put all this together, it's clear that ancient Rome wasn't just an empire of laws, it was an empire of taboos. A world where the visible and invisible were woven so tightly that to break a social rule was to risk not only disgrace, but divine punishment. But we're not done yet. Some of the most shocking taboos in Roman culture involved the gods themselves, and how mortals were expected to behave in their presence. To truly understand the forbidden side of Rome, we need to step into its temples, places that glimmered with gold, incense, and mystery. Because here, in the shadow of marble gods, existed some of the most dangerous taboos of all. The Romans believed that the gods were always watching, and that the relationship between mortals and deities was a delicate contract, a constant exchange of respect, offerings, and obedience. If a human broke that balance, the punishment wasn't simply personal, it could fall upon the entire city. This was the fear behind the Latin phrase ira deorum, the wrath of the gods. And that fear governed how Romans behaved in temples, during festivals, and even while praying. One forbidden act was turning your back to the altar during a ritual. To do so was seen as an insult, a physical rejection of the divine presence. Priests had to follow exact movements, the right hand to pour the wine, the right knee to kneel, the right words recited perfectly. Even a single slip of the tongue could ruin a ceremony. In such cases, the entire ritual had to be repeated from the beginning, because a misspoken word might attract the wrong god or unleash the wrong kind of power. Religion in Rome wasn't about faith, it was about precision. Mistakes were dangerous. Another taboo revolved around the worship of foreign gods. Ironically, Rome was full of them. As the empire expanded, new deities poured in from Egypt, Persia, and the East. Some were accepted, like Isis and Mithras, while others were outlawed. The Senate feared that foreign cults could weaken Roman morals or challenge imperial authority. The worship of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, was one of the most famous examples. In 186 before Christ, the Senate discovered secret bacchanalian gatherings, wild nighttime rituals filled with music, intoxication, and rumored sexual orgies. The Romans saw these ceremonies as not only immoral but politically subversive. The bacchanalia were banned, and thousands of followers were executed or imprisoned. From then on, public worship was tightly controlled by law. To pray to the wrong god in the wrong way could make you an enemy of the state. Even the emperor's image became sacred. Statues of Augustus or Nero weren't just political symbols. They were objects of worship. Spitting near one, touching it disrespectfully, or failing to show reverence could be considered blasphemy. During certain reigns, this reached absurd levels. People were executed for casually mentioning bad omens connected to the emperor's name. Once, a man was killed for owning a coin that bore the likeness of the ruler, simply because he had carried it into a public bath. The steam, officials said, defiled the sacred face. There was also the terrifying taboo of naming forbidden gods, deities so ancient and powerful that even saying their names aloud was believed to bring disaster. The goddess Angerona, for example, was worshipped in silence. Her statue's mouth was covered, symbolizing the power of secrecy itself. And the god Pluto, ruler of the underworld, was rarely named directly. Romans used euphemisms like dis pater, the rich father, because the mere mention of his name might summon him from the depths. Finally, there were the ritual silences, moments when absolute quiet was required. During a sacrifice, even a sneeze could ruin the ceremony. If a dog barked or a slave dropped something, it was considered a terrible omen. The ritual had to stop immediately and begin again from the start. To us, it sounds extreme, but to a Roman, it was the price of divine favor. Every act, every word, every gesture was weighed against an invisible scale of purity. And yet, the most dangerous taboo of all wasn't about the gods. It was about questioning the gods themselves. To question the gods, that was the ultimate act of defiance in ancient Rome. In a society built upon ritual, obedience, and divine order, doubt itself became a kind of heresy. Religion wasn't something you believed in privately. It was a public duty, an obligation to the state. Every Roman was expected to perform sacrifices, attend festivals, and thank the gods for victories. To refuse was to betray not only heaven, but also the empire. This is why atheism, or even philosophical skepticism, was considered a taboo. To deny the existence of the gods was to reject the foundation of Roman identity. When the philosopher Diagoras of Melos was accused of mocking religion, he fled for his life. Centuries later, Christians faced the same fate, not because of their faith itself, but because they refused to honor Jupiter, Mars, and the emperor's divine image. To the Roman mind, this refusal was rebellion, a dangerous contagion that could anger the gods and bring misfortune upon everyone. The persecution of Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ wasn't only about politics, it was about taboo. Refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods was like poisoning the spiritual bloodstream of the empire. When disasters struck, plagues, fires, invasions, people whispered that the Christians had offended the divine powers. In their eyes, impiety wasn't an individual sin, it was a public crime. But even among pagans, blasphemy had limits. The playwrights and poets of Rome could mock politicians, ridicule lovers, and laugh at human folly, but they dared not make jokes about the gods themselves. When someone did, punishment often came swiftly. The poet Ovid, for example, was mysteriously exiled by Augustus after writing The Art of Love, a book that made light of sacred Roman morals. The reason for his exile was never fully explained, but Ovid himself hinted that he had seen something he should not have seen, perhaps a private ritual, perhaps an imperial secret. In Rome, knowledge could be a curse, and curiosity was often a forbidden act. There's a chilling beauty in how the Romans treated taboo. They didn't see it as irrational fear, but as part of the world's natural order. To them, certain things were simply not meant to be touched, like the flame of Vesta, the name of the city, or the bones of the ancestors. It wasn't superstition, it was respect. The Romans believed that life existed between two forces, pietas, duty and reverence, and nephos, the forbidden, and to live well was to walk carefully between them. Even the mightiest emperors learned this lesson. When Caligula tried to defy the gods by declaring himself one, his rule descended into madness. When Nero mocked the sacred games and declared his art divine, Rome burned. The people whispered that the gods were reclaiming their honor. Over and over, history reminded them that no man, no matter how powerful, could escape the invisible hand of taboo. And perhaps that's the true legacy of ancient Rome. An empire that believed power without reverence would always destroy itself. Their temples may be ruins now, their gods long silent, but the echoes of those forbidden rules still live in us, in the way we treat death, purity, respect, and even silence. Because every civilization, no matter how advanced, hides its own sacred boundaries, and those who dare to cross them often pay the price. If you enjoyed uncovering the dark secrets of ancient Rome, don't forget to leave a comment. What taboo shocked you the most? Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, because there are many more hidden stories from history waiting for you here. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may the gods of Rome watch over you, or perhaps beware when they do. Remember, we are the ones who remember, the ones who question, the ones who refuse to bow to the silence of history. And you, are you ready for the next secret of Rome?